Today we are going to discuss the non-progressive shock, which is also known as compensated shock. We previously discussed in our last few lectures that basically the shock has three main stages. One is the non-progressive stage, the second is the progressive stage, and the third is the irreversible stage. Now, we discussed the shock that it is a condition in which there is inadequate perfusion. Now, for example, this is the heart and it is normally pumping the blood to the tissues, and the tissues are basically taking the oxygen and nutrients, and then the deoxygenated blood is being returned to the heart. But in shock, there is insufficient perfusion of blood, inadequate perfusion of the body tissues, so their normal needs, the needs of the body tissues cannot be fulfilled, and that condition is basically labeled as shock. Now, the initial stages of the shock is considered as non-progressive shock because it is not progressing. It is not progressing. It is a shock of a milder degree or small scale. Now, this is non-progressive shock because it is compensated. The shock is basically compensated with the help of some compensatory mechanisms of the body. Now, to completely understand the shock and the different types of shock, we have discussed them in detail in the last 3 to 4 lectures. You can watch those lectures. But now today we are going to discuss those compensatory mechanisms which make the shock non-progressive, or which basically makes it a compensated shock. Now, we will take the example of hemorrhagic shock in this condition. We will take a shock of example of hemorrhagic shock in which, for example, there is bleeding occur. For example, blood loss has occurred. Hemorrhagic shock is due to bleeding. So bleeding has occurred and the volume of the blood has reduced. Now, we have discussed hemorrhagic shock in detail and the different stages of hemorrhagic shock, the stages at which the non-progressive stage become a progressive stage. Here, just we consider an example is how the different compensatory mechanisms will compensate the shock and will not allow it to become progressive. So, the first and most important mechanism is the baroreceptor reflexes. The baroreceptor reflexes. Now, baroreceptors are basically present here. The baroreceptors are basically present in the bifurcation of carotid arteries. Now, these receptors basically detect a decrease in the arterial pressure, and they basically send signals to the brain, and brain in turn sends signals to the different blood vessels in the heart. Now, whenever there is a decrease or increase in arterial pressure, that change is detected first of all by the baroreceptors. The baroreceptors are most commonly present at the bifurcation of the carotid arteries. Now, this is an important mechanism, an important reflex, which basically helps in compensation and which basically helps in preventing the progression of the shock, and which makes it a non-progressive. So whenever bleeding has occurred and there is a decrease in the blood volume, and due to which there is a fall in the arterial pressure, that fall will initially be detected by different receptors. Those receptors will send signals to the brain, and brain will directly send signals to the veins, to the arteries, and the heart, and constriction of the arterioles will occur, which will basically increase the systemic resistance. Constriction of the veins will occur, which will basically push the blood towards the heart, and increase in heart rate will occur. Now, this is the sympathetic response, and we have discussed sympathetic response in detail, but it gets activated in response of baroreceptors. So, baroreceptor reflexes are one compensatory mechanisms in the non-progressive shock, or which basically prevents the progression of non-progressive shock to the progressive shock. The second mechanism is basically CNS ischemic response. Now, CNS ischemic response is similar to the baroreceptor, but it gets activated only when there is a higher degree fall in arterial pressure. When there is a higher degree fall in arterial pressure and there is a decreased perfusion of the brain, then in the same way is the brain centers got activated with the help of baroreceptor reflexes, they get activated with the help of a higher fall, and the brain activates the sympathetics more, and more constriction of the arteriole, more constriction of the veins, and increase in higher in heart rate occurs. But the difference is that the baroreceptor gets activated with a small fall in the arterial pressure, but the CNS ischemic response occurs only when there is a higher fall in the arterial pressure, a bigger fall in the arterial pressure has occurred, and there is decreased perfusion of the brain tissue, the higher centers, which basically detects the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, and they are very much sensitive to the changes in the arterial pressure. Those centers basically get activated, and they send stronger sympathetic signals to the arteries, to the veins, and to the heart rate. And both these baroreceptor reflexes and the CNS ischemic response, they in turn help to increase the arterial pressure back towards normal. Now, these are two reflexes. The third thing is the stress relaxation, reverse stress relaxation of circulatory system. Now, it is important to discuss that it is reverse stress relaxation. What happens in the stress relaxation is that whenever there is increased constriction, there is increase in the arterial pressure. When there is increase in the arterial pressure, there is relaxation. There is relaxation of the blood vessels, so that the arterial pressure falls back, so that the arterial pressure decreases. But in shock, what happens is that reverse stress relaxation occurs. Reverse stress relaxation occurs because due to hemorrhage, due to blood loss, there is decrease in the filling pressure. There is decrease in the venous return. So the arterial pressure basically falls. The arterial pressure decreases. So in turn, the blood vessels, the arterioles, the veins, they basically constrict. They increase the systemic resistance, and they basically increase the venous return towards the heart, and they in turn increases the arterial pressure. So it is reverse stress relaxation. In stress relaxation, the blood vessel, they basically relax or dilate, but in reverse stress relaxation, due to fall in arterial pressure, due to hemorrhage, due to blood loss, they basically constrict, and due to constriction, there is constriction of the arterioles, which basically increases the systemic resistance, and which in turn increases the arterial pressure. And there is also constriction of the veins, which basically push more blood towards the heart, so that more blood is available to the heart, and it can function normally and pump proper amount of blood to the tissues. Now, the third mechanism, another mechanism, is basically formation of angiotensin. If these mechanisms are not able to maintain the arterial pressure, to maintain the perfusion, and still there is decreased blood loss, there is decreased blood supply or decreased perfusion of the body tissues, then what happens is that the arterial pressure decreases so much that there is decreased perfusion of the body tissue, especially the kidney. Now, this is the kidney. When there is decreased perfusion of the kidney, a special substance known as the angiotensin, it is secreted from the kidney. Now, this is the kidney. Now, this angiotensin is secreted because of fall in the arterial pressure. This angiotensin will help again in the constriction of the arteriole, constriction of the veins, and it will also help in fluid retention. Now, normally, the kidney is filtering fluid, and it is excreting extra fluid in the form of urine. It is going out of the body. But with the secretion of angiotensin, there is more retention of the fluid occurring, because there is loss of blood, and due to loss of blood, there is decrease in the arterial pressure. So, due to decrease in the arterial pressure being detected by the kidneys, it secretes the angiotensin, which will not only start constriction of the arterioles and veins, but it will also help in maintaining or retaining more fluid in the system. So when more fluid is being retained in the system, it will basically help to recover the fluid loss, and it will basically help to increase the fluid. It will basically increase the fluid in the system, which will in turn increase the arterial pressure, and when the arterial pressure increases, the perfusion of the different body tissue will increase. Now, after that, another mechanism used for which basically helps in the compensation or in the non-progressive shock is the formation of vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone by the posterior pituitary gland. Now, when there is decreased arterial pressure being detected by the brain, the posterior pituitary gland in the brain will basically then secrete the antidiuretic hormone. Now, this antidiuretic hormone is also considered as vasopressin. It has two names. So, vasopressin, it is because it presses the vessels. It will press, or it will constrict the blood vessels. It will constrict the arterioles. It will constrict the veins. Now, it will help just like the baroreceptor reflex or the CNS ischemic response or any other mechanisms, which basically increases the constriction of arterioles and veins, and increases the venous return, and increases the systemic resistance. So it will be functioning like as a vasopressin, but on top of that, it also acts as antidiuretic. Now, diuresis is basically the formation of urine. Diuresis is the formation of urine, and ADH basically acts as an antidiuretic hormone. It stops the formation of it basically decreases the diuresis, it decreases the formation of urine, and it also basically helps in the fluid retention. So more fluid is retained by the kidneys with the help of antidiuretic hormone, which is basically secreted by the posterior pituitary gland in the brain. Now, all these mechanisms, the baroreceptor reflexes, the CNS ischemic response, the reverse stress relaxation, the angiotensin, the vasopressin or the ADH, all of them are basically trying to increase the arteriolar pressure, to increase the venous pressure, and to bring back more fluid into the body, or start fluid retention. Now, the purpose is to make available more fluid in the body, because they are trying to compensate. They are trying to compensate the fluid loss, the blood loss that has occurred, and they are trying to maintain the arterial pressure. So that with the maintained arterial pressure, there is normal perfusion of the body. The heart can pump normal amount of blood, and all the tissues of the body can be perfused properly. Now, the final mechanism is basically the mechanisms that return the blood volume back towards normal. Now, all those mechanisms like increase fluid intake, drinking more fluid, increase absorption from the intestine, increased fluid absorption from the intestine will bring back more fluid into the system. Drinking more fluid will basically bring back more fluid into the system. And finally, inside the interstitial fluid, now I will explain the interstitial fluid. These are different cells, and these cells are basically perfused by different capillaries. Now, there is a lot of fluid between the cells, which is basically the interstitial fluid. Now, this fluid between the different cells, which is the interstitial fluid, it also comes into the system. It comes into the system with the help of different capillaries, with the help of different venules and veins into the system. So they basically also help in the fluid retention. So basically increasing the fluid intake, drinking more fluid, and absorption of more fluid from the intestine, and bringing back the interstitial fluid into the system. All these mechanisms basically helps in maintaining or increasing the fluid in the system. Increasing fluid in the system, so that all the blood that has been lost is compensated with the help of fluid retention, and due to fluid retention and due to constriction of the blood vessels, the arterial pressure will recover, and there will be no much difference. And all the blood tissues will be perfused properly, and it will be considered as a non-progressive shock or a compensated shock, and there will be normal perfusion of the body tissues, and a person can survive a small amount of blood loss. Now, in the next lecture and the coming more lectures, we will discuss the further stages of the shock, which are basically progressive shock and the irreversible shock. But so far, this is the first stage of the shock. This is basically a non-progressive stage, and it is a compensated stage, and this is a milder degree of shock. And in this milder degree of shock, all the body mechanisms, they basically try to increase or normalize the arterial pressure, so there is normal perfusion, and all the tissues of the body, all the cells of the body can receive the proper amount of blood, despite of some fluid loss, despite of some hemorrhage, despite of some blood loss, despite of some accident which has occurred. Now, to summarize, all the compensatory mechanisms which basically help to maintain the arterial pressure in the non-progressive shock or the compensated shock include the baroreceptor reflexes. The baroreceptors are present in the carotid arteries. They detect the decrease in arterial pressure, and they send signals to the brain, and in turn brain sends signals to the arteries, veins, and heart rate. It increases constriction, increases the heart rate, and increases the arterial pressure. Then the CNS ischemic response. The CNS, the central nervous system, basically detects fall in arterial pressure. It sends more signals to the arteries, veins, and heart rate, and it also in return increases the constriction and heart rate and increases the arterial pressure. Now, another mechanism is reverse stress relaxation of the circulatory system, which is basically constriction of the blood vessel when there is fluid loss. When there is fluid loss, there is more constriction of the blood vessels, which also basically help in increasing the venous return. Finally, there is formation of angiotensin and vasopressin. Angiotensin from the kidneys and vasopressin from the brain, the posterior pituitary gland, which basically helps in fluid retention. They decrease the amount of urine formation, and they bring back more fluid into the system. And they try to compensate for the blood loss which has occurred in any accident. Finally, increasing the fluid intake, increasing absorption of fluid from the intestine, and mobilizing the fluid from the interstitial fluid into the circulation. All of these systems basically help in increasing the arterial pressure and compensating the shock. Now, the CNS, the baroreceptor reflexes, and the CNS ischemic response, they basically act within seconds. These systems basically act within seconds. But the angiotensin mechanism, the antidiuretic hormone mechanism, they will take around an hour, for example. So some of the systems will basically act directly and very quickly, but some of the system will act slowly. But ultimately, the purpose of all these mechanisms is to compensate the shock and to prevent the progression of shock from non-progressive into progressive shock. That's all about non-progressive or compensated shock. Thanks a lot for watching the video.